Hello everyone, welcome to another Damwon video. This is a follow-up to the last video on Damwon Gaming and how to beat them, which is linked in the description below. Basically, before the semifinals, we talked about Damwon's drafts, early game patterns and holes G2 could have tried to exploit. The main points we've discussed were Canyon's early paths, which heavily tended towards the top side of the map and the top side scuttle crab, Nuguri's tendency to get himself into trouble and awkward situations when Canyon couldn't get a topside crab and topside control in the early game, Beryl's lackluster engages without Canyon standing and moving with him, and some draft patterns. The teamfight front to back mode, regular front to back with a lot of range and disengage ability. The teamfight flank mode with a flanker in the top lane such as Cannon or an Ecton when he is paired with a Nidalee, and the Camille TF comp. Basically, the only time Damwon was faced with a curveball before the semifinals, they've lost that game to JDG trying to counter their own TF Camille comp. For more on that, go watch the video. In this video, I would like to talk about Damwon's adaptations throughout the semifinals and the finals. How did they change their playstyle to match the opponents they did not know from LCK for a BO5? Are they really unbeatable? While playing versus Suning, Damwon played mostly as they did in LCK. They went for the regular teamfighting comps, as TF was banned away from them for all of the games. Damwon did not try anything we didn't see from them, maybe except for the Evelynn pick, which they've lost with. And even with the Evelynn, the comp was made to front-to-back teamfight with Eve disrupting Suning's backline and dissuading them from split pushing. It of course didn't let them get the early topside prio they love so much, which eventually ended up with SOFM smurfing on the entire game. In the finals, we saw nothing new from Damwon Gaming. Versus G2 though, it was a different story. Damwon were clearly very cautious approaching G2 and used some specific tactics we didn't see them use before to take them down. Let's talk about the adaptations in draft and gameplay that Damwon have made for the best of 5 versus G2. While talking about that, we will uncover some weaknesses of Damwon that might have been taken advantage of with a longer tournament to play or by a more experienced opponent in the finals. Let's start with the first game. Damwon, knowing that they need to neutralize G2's playmaking in the early to mid-game stages when everyone gets their level 6, prioritize the TF highly. They have played this pick differently than usual, but we will get into that later. I want to start with the Hecarim pick from the first game. Knowing that G2 is not very efficient playing around the jungle lead and accelerating the jungle matchup, Damwon picked Hecarim for the first time ever against Jankos' Lilia. In this matchup, Lilia needs to use her faster and healthier early game clear to start punishing the Hecarim and basically get a meaningful hit before Hecarim can get his Trinity or even at the point when he gets most of his components. By that time, if they are even, the Hecarim can take over the game by bursting down the Lilia or the laners that are trying to help her. With G2 though, for the most part, the laners can't really play around Jankos and the enemy camp timings without globals in top and mid, which Damwon smartly covered with the Shen ban and TF pick. This created a situation where G2 are on a timer but can't really accelerate the game through anything. The bot lane draft is practically unwinnable, it's very hard to early dive the GP without a strong diving duo, and Sylas just sits there until level 6 when he can start making plays. Jankos and G2 didn't do anything, watching while Canyon farmed up a storm until G2 took that horrendous fight in the river trying to salvage the early game and gave up the entire game for it. G2 couldn't do things in the early stages because of the bot lane draft and their own weaknesses as we've discussed, which leads us to the next point, the TF pick. This pick neutralizes G2's playmaking after the level 6 because TF can of course react to every play on the map. The interesting change Damwon have made with this pick is that instead of picking him as an accelerator for their comp, basically using the ulti off cooldown, they built around it a comp that outscales G2's comp and used him as a neutralizer for their playmaking. G2 couldn't go for plays because Showmaker held his ult, waiting to counter a play G2 initiated. They used the TF to make sure they can safely scale into the mid to late game when their comp can take control and win the match. They also did that in the fourth game, planning to neutralize G2's mid-jungle duo after level 6, but Caps did that on his own dying at level 3 without jungle intervention. They also tried that in the second game, when they themselves picked the Sylas into the TF. Again, Showmaker didn't want to ult himself, but to threaten to follow Caps wherever he goes and stop G2's acceleration plays, eventually outscaling G2 with the stronger side laners in Fiora and Sylas versus the TF and Camille. It did not go as planned though. Thirdly, Damwon tried and successfully crushed 3 out of the 4 early bot lane waves into G2's tower by securing the early winning 2v2, except for in the Jhin plus Pantheon game. They did that to prevent G2 from hard snowballing the bot lane with early dives and plays around the first crash. G2 got to pull a play like that in the third game for the first time, but then because of an overrigger dive it did not work out. In games 1, 2 and 4, Damwon have managed to get their hand on the early pushing bot lane, crashed the wave and disappeared. G2 couldn't use this window and the fact that Canyon is on the top side to snowball the early game through the bot lane like they wanted. To be fair, Damwon's bot lane tries to crash the first waves in almost every game they play, it's part of the Damwon system. In this series though, it mattered a lot, as G2 chose to try and snowball through Mickey and Perks but couldn't do so for 3 out of the 4 games. In the Jin game, when they could finally push out first, they threw the game with an over-air dive. Lastly, I would like to mention 2 quick weaknesses Damwon have showed in this series. The first being their inability to counter the TF Camille comp. This is their second attempt to do that in the tournament and their second loss to this comp. As we've discussed in the last video, in their game vs JDG, they've tried to pick Set and Galio into the Camille and TF and lost. The Set should have crushed Camille in the early game while Galio is neutralizing TF's plays and always threatens an all-in, especially if TF loses his flash early on. In the G2 game, the Fiora and Sylas duo is supposed to give Damwon the edge in the later stages, when the Fiora outscales pretty much every champion in the game in the side lane, and Sylas neutralizing TF's playmaking in the early game and outscaling him himself in the other side lane, or in a 2v2 with the Fiora. Both attempts failed pretty hard though, because those comps are getting Damwon out of their non-early game pattern. With Fiora into Camille, even though they did end up getting topside prio and the first topside grab, G2, through unlocking Mickey and moving him to the top side, made Damwon lose the top control earlier than expected. From here on out, Nuguri kept inting until they were way too far behind. In their game vs JDG, JDG just straight out outplayed the situation and got out of the early game pretty scot-free. It seems like Damwon cannot find a good counter to this comp and had trouble playing against it. This in itself isn't that big of a problem, because they only have to invest one ban to prevent it from showing up against them, and they are of course very good at piloting this comp themselves, so they only have to ban it out on the red side. Secondly, and more importantly, Damwon does not have a lot more than what we've seen. They are, and by a margin, the best team in the world, don't get me wrong. But if the tournament was a bit longer, maybe with a losers bracket, teams like G2 and JDG would have given them a run for their money. And now I'll explain. Damwon have shown clear favoritism towards their known drafts, the teamfighting comps with the range advantage or the flanker, but what about some other styles? When playing from red side, the stronger side in this meta, they had some interesting things prepared, like the Hecarim to the Lilia, after being able to lock in a strong AD carry to the bot lane and the TF to make sure the map is neutralized. Their problem showed when they were playing from the blue side. When playing from blue side, Damwon have tried to go for comfort with their front to back comps, hoping G2 would fuck up. They were the higher seed, so they had the side selection and started on the red side, lost the second game when G2 moved to the red side, and probably should have lost the fourth game as well from draft perspective. The early game went so horribly wrong, with Caps dying at level 3 and Jankos having to give up the bot lane scuttle crab, not giving his bot lane the space they needed and could have had. G2 could have won that game because Damwon's answers on the blue side were lackluster. If Caps doesn't die there, Jankos gets the bot side crab, and the Senna, On and Sylas get to scale a bit more. If G2 could have secured one out of the first 2 Drakes, which is of course not an easy task versus a Caitlyn, don't get me wrong, they should have had a free cruise to the finish line, outranging and outscaling Damwon. Damwon's blue side drafts had weird win conditions that relied more on G2 fucking up than on Damwon doing proactive things, and it showed. It was either a weird win condition or one of the comps we already know. Maybe with a different team in quarters, Damwon would have shown a bit more and G2 would have given them a better run for their money. Maybe JDG could have not played the worst series of their lives versus Suning, get to the finals and show us their amazing macro game. In another universe, metas could have been holding for longer in League of Legends, giving the time for smart teams to find a solution to a certain playstyle. But those are just maybes. Damwon is the best team in the world, and it's undeniable. But their flaws are undeniable as well. The meta had fitted them perfectly, and a new undiscovered way of playing would have needed to come up from a creative team for Damwon to lose a best of 5. The chances are the meta will shift, and I don't see them staying on top in a different meta, but we will have to wait and see. Thank you everyone so much for watching. Check out my channel for more videos that I have done. Make sure to subscribe for future content.